I saw it sitting on the kitchen counter, an official-looking envelope marked Greater Lakeside Homeowners Association. My first instinct was to ignore it. As a former SWAT officer, I was used to dealing with much more serious threats than HOA complaints. But something about this envelope felt different. Maybe it was the thick paper, or the way the letter was so neatly folded, like they were trying to make it seem more official than it really was. I opened it, not knowing that this seemingly harmless letter would set off a chain of events that would shake my entire world. The letter started with a formal tone. "We are writing to inform you of several violations on your property that must be corrected immediately." I skimmed through the list: an unapproved paint color on the fence, an allegedly overgrown garden, and something about my mailbox being too rustic for the neighborhood's aesthetic standards. At first, I thought it was some sort of joke. I had lived here for years, and my property was in great shape. The idea that my garden, a few well-maintained roses, and a small vegetable patch was overgrown was laughable. But the letter took a darker turn as I read on. Failure to comply within 30 days will result in a $5,000 fine and mandatory inspection by our HOA enforcement team. Failure to cooperate will lead to further legal action, including forced sale of the property. I sat there for a moment, processing what I had just read. Forced sale? Legal action? A fine for what? For having a little more color on my fence than they deemed acceptable? I could feel my blood begin to boil. This wasn't some friendly HOA trying to encourage uniformity in the neighborhood. This was something else. Something was off, and I wasn't about to let them get away with it. As a former SWAT officer, I knew what real threats looked like, and this wasn't one of them. But I also knew better than to underestimate an enemy who might be playing by a different set of rules. I wasn't going to let them push me around. I folded the letter and set it down. If they thought they could bully me into submission, they were gravely mistaken. A few days later, I was sitting in my office, going through some paperwork, when I heard a knock at the door. It was a sharp, firm knock, one that made me stand up from my chair instinctively. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I walked toward the door with some caution. Through the peephole, I saw two men standing at the doorstep. They were dressed in dark uniforms, both with the kind of tactical gear you'd expect to see on law enforcement officers. One of them held a clipboard, and the other had a radio strapped to his chest. My first thought was that something had happened in the neighborhood, and they were responding to an emergency. But then I remembered the letter from the HOA, and the sudden tightness in my chest told me this wasn't an ordinary visit. I opened the door, standing tall. "Can I help you?" The man with the clipboard gave me a tight smile, flashing a badge that looked vaguely official, but it didn't sit right with me. "Good afternoon, sir. We're from the HOA enforcement team. We're here to conduct an inspection of your property for compliance with community standards." I immediately felt a red flag go up. I was a former SWAT officer, and my training kicked in. Their uniforms seemed too polished, too rehearsed, and the way they were standing told me they were used to intimidating people. These weren't real police officers, and I could see they were trying to act as though they had more authority than they actually did. "You're here for an inspection?" I asked, my voice cool and controlled. "Do you have a warrant?" The man with the clipboard didn't flinch, but his smile was starting to look strained. "We're conducting an official inspection on behalf of the Greater Lakeside Homeowners Association. We've received complaints about property violations, and we need to check the condition of your land." I stepped forward, keeping a calm, steady demeanor. "I don't believe you have the legal right to inspect my property without a warrant. You're trespassing. If this is an HOA matter, you should have sent the paperwork, not sent men in uniforms to intimidate me." The other man, who had been standing silently at the back, shifted uncomfortably, as if unsure whether to back up his colleague or step in. The first man, clearly trying to maintain control of the situation, replied, "We're within our rights to ensure compliance, sir. If you refuse this entry, there will be consequences." "Consequences?" I raised an eyebrow. "You're not police officers, and you don't have any legal authority over my property. So, if you're done, I suggest you leave." The two men exchanged a quick look, and for a moment I thought they might push further. But then the man with the clipboard nodded. "We'll be back," he said, his voice dripping with the kind of smug confidence that people who think they're untouchable tend to have. As they turned to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't going to be the end of it. They had come once. Now that they knew I wasn't backing down, I was certain they'd come again, and next time they wouldn't just show up with their fake badges. They'd try something else. And I needed to be ready. I'd hoped that the first visit would be enough to scare them off. I had made it clear that I wasn't going to be intimidated by a couple of fake enforcement officers, but deep down, I knew this wasn't over. I had underestimated their persistence, and I knew they wouldn't just back down after a single encounter. 2 days later, I was sitting in my living room when I heard it, another knock at the door. This time, it wasn't just two men. This time, there were four of them, all in full tactical gear, standing in front of my home like they were preparing to raid a drug cartel's compound. They weren't even trying to hide their intentions anymore. I could feel the aggression in the air before I even opened the door. "Afternoon, Chief," the leader of the group, one of the men who had visited before, said, this time with an even more insistent tone. "We're here to conduct a full inspection of your property. If you don't cooperate, there will be serious consequences." I stepped out onto the porch, standing tall. "I've told you once already, you have no right to be here. You're not law enforcement, and I'm not letting you in. You don't have a warrant, and this whole operation is a scam. Now, I'm giving you one last chance to walk away." The leader looked at me, trying to size me up. But I could see in his eyes that this wasn't just about enforcing some HOA rules anymore. This was personal. They had been trying to force me into submission, and now they were escalating. It was clear they weren't used to being refused, and it made them even more dangerous. "If you don't comply, we'll have to involve other authorities," he said, attempting to sound like a real police officer. His voice had an edge to it now. "We're authorized to seize your property if we find any more violations. You don't want to make this more difficult than it needs to be." The moment he mentioned seizing my property, something inside me snapped. This wasn't just about petty fines or violations anymore. They were trying to take my home, and that was something I would never let happen without a fight. "I'm not afraid of you," I said, my voice steady and firm. "You're not law enforcement, and I'm not going to let you bully me or my family. I've already told you what I will do if you keep this up. Now you can either leave, or I will make sure you regret stepping foot on my property again." I could see the hesitation in their eyes now, but the leader quickly regained his composure. He gave a quick nod to his men, and they began to move towards my gate. But I wasn't about to let them walk all over me. I took out my phone and began recording. I filmed the entire interaction, capturing every word and every threatening gesture. They could try to intimidate me, but they wouldn't be able to get away with it this time. "You're trespassing. I have it on camera," I said, still recording. "Now leave. If you don't, I'll call the sheriff, and I'll make sure everyone knows what you're doing here." For a moment, they looked at each other, unsure whether to push forward or back down. Eventually, the leader exhaled through his nose and motioned for his team to turn around. "We'll be back," he said once more, but there was no conviction in his voice this time. As they retreated, I felt a mix of anger and determination. This was no longer just about defending my property. It was about exposing them for what they were, fraudulent enforcers who were trying to steal from me and anyone else who wouldn't comply. I knew I had to take action, and I had the skills, connections, and experience to make sure they didn't get away with it. After that second encounter, I knew I couldn't just wait for them to show up again. It was time to dig deeper and figure out exactly who these so-called HOA enforcers were, and who was pulling the strings behind the scenes. With my background in law enforcement, I had the skills and connections to investigate them without drawing attention. The first thing I did was go to the local government and property records office. I started tracing the ownership of the neighborhood properties, looking for any patterns that might indicate a connection between the HOA and potential real estate developers. What I found was more than enough to make my blood run cold. Several of the properties that had been targeted by the HOA's enforcement team had been sold at ridiculously low prices, often under duress, and almost always after some sort of fabricated violation had been claimed. In some cases, the homeowners had been so intimidated by the threat of fines and forced sales that they had signed away their property without a fight. The next step was looking into the HOA's board members. I reached out to a few old contacts in the police department, asking if they could help me dig into the HOA's financial records. What I uncovered was damning. The HOA board had been involved in backroom deals with a group of developers who were quietly acquiring properties under the guise of enforcing community standards. The developers had been using the HOA to drive down property values, targeting owners who couldn't afford legal battles or fines. And, in turn, they were flipping these homes for massive profits. It became clear to me this wasn't just about nuisance violations. The HOA was running an organized scam to force people out of their homes, and the so-called enforcement officers were just the hired muscle they used to intimidate residents. I gathered everything I could, property records, emails, financial documents, and pieced it all together. The HOA wasn't just a rogue organization with overzealous rules. It was a corrupt entity working with developers to exploit homeowners. And they had been doing it for years. But now I had a decision to make: how to expose them without risking my family's safety. I knew that if I went public with this, there would be backlash. These developers and the HOA had power, and they weren't afraid to use it. I also knew that I couldn't fight them alone. It was time to call in reinforcements. I reached out to a few trusted former colleagues who owed me favors, officers with connections, legal advisors, and people who had seen this kind of corruption before and knew how to take it down. This wasn't just about protecting my property anymore. It was about protecting everyone in the neighborhood who had been manipulated and exploited. And I was going to make sure they didn't get away with it. Once I had uncovered enough to know that the HOA wasn't just an overzealous neighborhood association but a full-fledged criminal operation, I knew I couldn't take them down on my own. The odds were stacked against me. They had connections, resources, and judging by the way they had been operating, plenty of experience getting away with things. So I began calling in the people I trusted most. People I had worked with during my time in SWAT, men and women who knew how to handle high-stakes situations, people who weren't afraid to stand up to corruption, no matter how deep it ran. First, I called Jack, an old buddy from the police force. He was one of the best detectives I'd ever worked with. "Hey, Jack," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I need your help with something. It's about the HOA in Greater Lakeside. They've been running a scam, using fake enforcers to bully people out of their homes. I've got the evidence, but I need you to help me dig deeper into their financial ties and connections." Jack's voice was calm, but I could tell he was intrigued. "All right, I'm in. I'll see what I can pull up from the financial records. Let's get them." Next, I called Lauren, a former legal advisor who had been instrumental in a few high-profile cases back in the day. "I need your expertise," I told her. "I'm up against some heavy hitters, and I've got evidence that the HOA's been working with developers to push people out of their homes for profit. I need you to look over the legal documents, the contracts, and find me the smoking gun." Lauren didn't hesitate. "You've got it. I'll go through the paperwork, and we'll make sure the HOA doesn't get away with this." The final call was to my old commanding officer, Rob. He was a retired SWAT team leader, now working as a private investigator. If anyone had the connections and the knowledge to help me track down the shady developers and their ties to the HOA, it was him. "Rob, I need you to help me make sure I've got the right people in my sights," I said. "We're going to expose everything. Developers, shady contractors, the whole corrupt network. We need to put an end to this." "Leave it to me," Rob replied. "I'll start gathering intel on the developers involved. We'll get them all." With my team assembled, we began to work around the clock, following leads, gathering records, and making sure every piece of evidence was ironclad. I knew that this wasn't going to be a quick or easy battle. These people had been operating unchecked for far too long, and they wouldn't give up without a fight. But with my connections and the evidence in hand, we were ready to bring them down. We went over everything meticulously: contracts, emails, financial records, even surveillance footage of the fake officers harassing homeowners. The more we dug, the more connections we found: developers, local politicians, contractors, all working in tandem with the HOA, pushing their agenda forward at the expense of innocent families. The final piece of the puzzle was tracking down the money trail. If we could prove that the HOA was benefiting financially from their manipulation of homeowners, it would be the evidence we needed to blow the whole thing wide open. With all the evidence coming together, it was clear that the next step was to confront the fake officers head-on. They had been the muscle behind the HOA's scam, and now it was time to expose them for the frauds they were. We set up a meeting for the following week. I knew they wouldn't back down easily. After all, they'd been walking around with fake authority for months, and they weren't going to admit they'd been caught without a fight. But I was ready. I had the law on my side, and I was prepared to make sure they didn't walk away this time. I reached out to my trusted connections in law enforcement and arranged for some backup, just in case the situation escalated. Jack had gotten us access to some critical surveillance footage that caught the fake officers in the act, tampering with evidence, threatening residents, and planning fabricated violations on homeowners' properties. We had everything we needed, but I wanted to make sure these men knew exactly how serious I was. On the day of the confrontation, I stood at my front gate with my phone ready, recording every detail. The familiar black SUV appeared on the horizon, and I felt the familiar tension rise in my chest. This time, though, it was different. This time, I wasn't going to be intimidated. I had all the evidence, and I was ready to expose them. The SUV rolled up to my driveway, and the same two men, the leader and his lackey, stepped out. Their expressions were less confident than the last time I saw them. They were on edge, clearly aware that I wasn't going to just roll over. "Good afternoon, Chief," the leader said, trying to keep his voice steady, though there was a hint of nervousness in his tone. "We're here for a routine inspection." I took a deep breath and calmly replied, "I'm afraid that's not happening. Not today. You're not police officers, and you don't have the authority to be on my property. I got you on video planting evidence and making threats. You've been using fake credentials and false claims to intimidate my family and neighbors." The lackey stepped forward, his hand hovering near his belt as if he were trying to decide whether to draw something. I stepped back, keeping my phone trained on them. "I've recorded everything. I've already contacted the sheriff's department, and they'll be here soon." "You're done." The leader faltered for a moment, clearly realizing he was caught. "You don't understand," he said, his bravado cracking. "This isn't just about you. We've been following orders from the HOA. They'll make sure." "No," I interrupted, my voice firm. "You've been exploiting people, lying and stealing. The HOA will have to answer for this. But you're going to answer for your actions today." Before they could react, I saw the familiar flash of sheriff's cruisers pulling up behind the SUV. I wasn't alone anymore, and neither were they. The sheriff's deputies moved in swiftly, taking both men into custody without a word. The leader tried to protest, but the deputies weren't having it. "You're under arrest for impersonating law enforcement officers, harassment, and unlawful trespassing," one of the deputies said, reading them their rights. As the fake officers were handcuffed and led away, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. The power dynamic had shifted completely. They had been using their fake authority to instill fear in the neighborhood, but now they were the ones facing the consequences. This wasn't just a win for me, it was a win for the entire community. The corrupt system that had been manipulating residents for years was finally starting to crumble. With the fake officers in custody and the truth about their illegal actions exposed, I felt a surge of relief. The immediate threat had been neutralized, and the residents of the neighborhood were finally free from the intimidation they had endured for so long. But I knew that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The moment the arrest was made public, the HOA's legal team went into full damage control mode. It wasn't long before I received a letter from their attorneys, threatening to sue me for defamation and harassment. The letter was thick with legal jargon, accusing me of spreading false information and tarnishing the reputation of the HOA. They tried to claim that I had caused unnecessary distress to the community by making baseless accusations. Reading the letter, I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it. After everything that had come to light, the forged documents, the fake officers, the bullying tactics, I knew their legal threats were nothing but a last-ditch attempt to save face. They had been caught red-handed, and now they were trying to shift the blame onto me. It was the kind of manipulation I had seen countless times in my career as a police officer, but it wasn't going to work this time. I immediately called my legal team to discuss our response. We knew that we had the upper hand, and we weren't going to back down. I instructed them to file a counterclaim for harassment and abuse of power, using the evidence we had gathered, everything from the illegal actions of the HOA's enforcers to the financial dealings that showed how they were using their authority to push homeowners out of their properties. We also decided to go public. I called in the media, making sure they had all the details of the case and the evidence we had compiled. I wanted the entire community and the world to know what the HOA had been doing. The more eyes on this case, the harder it would be for the HOA to continue their lies. The legal team from the HOA was relentless. They filed motions to have the case thrown out, but we were prepared for their moves. Our documentation was airtight, and we had witnesses, dozens of them, who could testify about the intimidation and harassment they had endured at the hands of the HOA's fake enforcers. I also made sure to keep the pressure on by circulating the story, reminding everyone in the community that their rights had been violated, and they deserved justice. But the HOA wasn't done yet. They sent their legal team to try and intimidate me further. One day, I received a call from my attorney. They've got a few tricks left up their sleeves. They're offering a settlement to make this go away quietly, and they want you to back off. I wasn't interested in a settlement. The goal wasn't just to get compensation for myself. It was to make sure they couldn't continue their operations and that their victims got the justice they deserved. I held my ground. I'm not backing down. We're exposing this for what it is. Let's take this to court. The moment we decided to take the case to court, I knew it was going to be a fight. The HOA had far more resources, and their legal team was relentless. But we had something they didn't, the truth. And we weren't going to let them spin this into something it wasn't. The trial began with the HOA's lawyers attempting to discredit me, painting me as a disgruntled homeowner who was just trying to make a name for myself. They tried to downplay the seriousness of the fake police force and made it seem like my claims were exaggerated. But we had the evidence to back up everything we said, and they couldn't spin their way out of it. One by one, we presented our case. First, the footage of the fake officers intimidating residents and trespassing on properties. Then, the documents we had uncovered showing the HOA's involvement in shady real estate deals. We had photos, emails, contracts, everything that proved the HOA had been using illegal methods to force people out of their homes. My former colleagues in law enforcement, who had helped gather the evidence, took the stand to confirm the illegality of the HOA's actions. We also had several residents who had been affected by the HOA's tactics testify. They spoke about the harassment they had endured, how they had been bullied into selling their homes under duress, and how the HOA's fake police officers had threatened them with legal action. The turning point came when the HOA's legal team tried to bring in their expert witness, a so-called community enforcement officer who claimed to be a specialist in HOA regulations. But when cross-examined by my attorney, the witness's credibility quickly crumbled. It turned out that the expert had no formal qualifications, and his connection to the HOA was far too cozy to be considered objective. We tore apart his testimony in front of the judge, and the judge's expression turned from neutral to skeptical. I could feel the momentum swinging in our favor. The judge was growing increasingly frustrated with the HOA's lack of a solid defense. Every attempt they made to cover up their illegal activities was met with overwhelming evidence from our side. The closing arguments were the final nail in the coffin. My attorney passionately argued that the HOA had not only violated the rights of homeowners, but had also caused irreversible harm to families who had been intimidated into selling their properties. We asked for restitution, the disbanding of the HOA, and the prosecution of those involved in the fraudulent activities. When the judge finally gave her ruling, it was everything I had hoped for and more. The Greater Lakeside Homeowners Association is hereby found guilty of fraud, harassment, and unlawful activities. The HOA is to be disbanded immediately, and all property transactions resulting from coercion must be reversed. Those involved in the creation and implementation of the fraudulent enforcement team are to face criminal charges. I sat there, letting the weight of the words sink in. This wasn't just a victory for me. It was a victory for every person in the neighborhood who had been manipulated by the HOA. It was a blow to the corrupt system that had been operating in the shadows, and it was the end of a long and painful chapter for the community. The ruling in our favor was a monumental victory, but it wasn't the end of the road. While the HOA was officially disbanded and its leaders were facing criminal charges, the community had been left to pick up the pieces. For years, people had lived under the fear of losing their homes, and the damage done to their trust and sense of security couldn't be fixed overnight. In the days following the court's decision, I worked closely with local officials and community leaders to begin the process of healing. It was clear that the HOA's actions had left deep scars. People were fearful of stepping forward or of trusting authority figures again. But I knew that if we were going to rebuild, it had to start with restoring that sense of trust and security. The first step was making sure that homeowners who had been intimidated into selling their properties could get their homes back. Legal teams were working around the clock to reverse fraudulent sales, with some properties being returned to their original owners. For those who had already moved on, we helped them navigate the legal system to get compensation for the damage the HOA's tactics had caused. We also began a series of community meetings where residents could voice their concerns, share their experiences, and discuss what needed to be done to ensure something like this never happened again. At first, people were hesitant, unsure if it was safe to speak up. But as the days went on, more and more families came forward, sharing their stories of how they had been harassed or tricked by the HOA. Through these meetings, we not only found a way to hold the remaining perpetrators accountable, but we also found a way to move forward together as a community. Neighbors who had once been divided by fear and suspicion began working together again. We formed a new, transparent community association, ensuring that every voice had a say in the decisions made for the neighborhood. This new HOA was built on trust, fairness, and the rule of law, something the old HOA had completely abandoned. Personally, I felt a sense of pride watching the community rebuild itself. I had spent years as a SWAT officer, fighting criminals in high-pressure situations, but I had never experienced anything as fulfilling as standing with my neighbors, ensuring that justice was served and that the truth came out. In the end, the victory was more than just about taking down a corrupt HOA. It was about restoring the power back to the people. We had reclaimed our homes, our community, and our trust in one another. The bond we shared was stronger than ever, and the neighborhood would forever be a symbol of resilience and justice.